At dinner, they ordered everything: steak, wine, appetizers I couldn't pronounce. Laughter that rose and fell easily as if nothing in the world required effort. When the plates finally came out, mine was the last to arrive. It was pushed gently toward me, almost apologetically, as though the server already knew it didn't belong. A smaller plate, food that had cooled while the others talked. A quiet voice, Lauren said, "You can have what's left. You don't eat much anyway, right?" No one looked at me when she said it. My name is Margaret Ellison. I'm 72 years old, and I have learned that humiliation doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives dressed as courtesy. I smiled. Not because I agreed, but because I've learned that reacting only gives people permission to explain why your feelings are inconvenient. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap and nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable. Across the table, my son Ryan was mid-conversation, leaning toward Lauren, laughing at something on his phone. He looked successful tonight: tailored jacket, confident posture, the kind of man who appears to have everything under control. He didn't notice the plate, or if he did, he chose not to. The table was long, polished wood, set with candles and expensive glassware. I sat at the far end near the kitchen doorway where the air felt slightly cooler. An extra chair had been pulled in at the last minute. No place card. No careful arrangement, just space that had to be filled because I had arrived. I wasn't offended by the food itself. I was offended by how easily I had become optional. Lauren cut into her steak, pink in the center, steam rising. "This place is amazing," she said, already planning the next visit out loud. "We should come here more often, the kids love it." I glanced at my grandson Evan seated beside her. He hadn't touched his food yet. His eyes flicked to my plate, then back to his mother's face. A small crease formed between his eyebrows, the kind that means a child understands something adults pretend not to see. He leaned toward me slightly. "Grandma, do you want some of mine?" he whispered. I shook my head gently. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But he wasn't convinced. He never was when things felt unfair. The conversation flowed around me: school programs, renovations, a vacation Ryan and Lauren were planning. They spoke casually about money, about upgrades, about timing. I recognized the numbers even when they didn't say them out loud. I always did. Money leaves fingerprints, even when you give it quietly. Ryan raised his glass. "To family," he said, smiling broadly. Everyone echoed it. I lifted my water glass a second too late. I took a bite of my food. It was cold but manageable. Cold food is easier to swallow when you've practiced swallowing disappointment. As I chewed, my mind drifted not to the dinner but to another table decades ago. A small kitchen, worn chairs, my late husband Paul at the head, sleeves rolled up, laughing softly as he served food before taking any himself. "Dignity first," he used to say, even before generosity. He believed that giving should never require shrinking, that love didn't mean disappearing. I used to argue with him about that. I don't anymore. Lauren reached across the table for the wine, passing it to Ryan without offering me any. Not deliberately cruel, just practiced. As if the order of things had been decided long ago and I had simply forgotten my place in it. When dessert arrived, it came with the same quiet imbalance. Everyone was served, then me, a thin slice, symbolic more than satisfying. No one noticed when I finished first. No one noticed when I folded my napkin again, slow and careful, like I was closing a chapter no one else realized they were reading. Ryan walked me to the door afterward, phone already in his hand. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, distracted. "I always do," I replied. Outside, the night air felt kinder than the dining room. My old car waited patiently at the curb. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, hands resting on it, watching the light spill from the windows of their house. Inside, laughter continued. Glasses clinked. Life moved on. I didn't cry. Crying suggests surprise. This wasn't new. It was just clearer. The drive home was quiet, streets familiar, stoplights predictable. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me with the kind of silence that doesn't judge or expect anything. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I moved through the rooms by memory, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a table. This house has never made me feel small. In the kitchen, I sat down and rested my hands on the wood. These hands had signed checks, folded laundry, held children, steadied a family. They had done their work without applause. On the counter sat a folder I had been avoiding for months: bank statements, automatic payments. Things I told myself were temporary. I didn't open it yet. Tonight wasn't about numbers. It was about noticing. I went to bed early, not exhausted, but resolved. The kind of resolve that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in quietly and waits for the right moment. Before sleep took me, I thought of Evan's face, the crease in his brow, the unasked question. Children know when something is wrong long before adults admit it. And somewhere between that thought and the darkness, I realized something with absolute clarity. I hadn't been treated like leftovers because I was unimportant. I had been treated that way because I allowed myself to be. By morning, that would change. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, but because my mind kept arranging memories into patterns I could no longer ignore. Sleep avoids clarity the way darkness avoids dawn. When I finally rose, the house was still dim. Early light filtered through the curtains, soft and pale, the way it always had. I moved through the kitchen quietly, making tea, listening to the familiar sounds, the kettle warming, the faint tick of the clock Paul once fixed with surprising patience. This house had never rushed me. I carried my mug to the table and sat down across from the chair Paul used to take. For a long time after he passed, I couldn't sit there. It felt like an absence too loud to bear. But this morning, it felt different, not empty, finished, complete in a way that no longer hurt. Paul believed in preparation, not pessimism, preparation. Being ready doesn't mean you expect the worst, he used to say. It just means you respect yourself enough not to be caught helpless. I hadn't respected myself in a long time. I opened the folder on the counter. Inside were bank statements stacked neatly, printed months apart. I didn't need to read every line to know what I'd find. I already knew. Still, I went through them slowly, one by one, the way you do when you're ready to see something clearly instead of hoping it will explain itself away. Mortgage assistance, insurance premiums, auto payments to accounts that were not mine, subscriptions I never used, tuition installments. Every line item carried my name. Every line item carried their comfort. It hadn't happened all at once. That's how these things work. No one asks for everything up front. They ask for help, then just a little more help. Then they stop asking and start assuming. Ryan's voice echoed in my head, calm, reasonable, practiced. It's just temporary, Mom. It's easier if we run it through your account. You're better with paperwork anyway. He never raised his voice, he never demanded. That's what made it easier to miss. Lauren was different. She never pretended it was temporary. She spoke as if certain things were simply meant to be handled by someone else. By me. You're so organized, she'd say. We'd be lost without you. Praise can be a leash when it's paired with expectation. I traced one payment with my finger, tuition, Evan's school. The number made me pause, not because it was large, but because I realized I hadn't been asked about it in years. It had simply continued. And yet at dinner I was given what was left, not because they forgot who I was, because they assumed I wouldn't mind. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Memory has a way of returning when invited. I saw Ryan at 12, standing in the driveway with a broken bike chain, frustration written across his face. Paul knelt beside him, calm as ever, showing him how to fix it instead of doing it for him. He'll learn faster if you don't rescue him, Paul said later, quietly. I'd argued then, he's just a boy. Paul had smiled. He won't always be. Somewhere along the way, I'd undone that lesson. After Paul passed, everything felt urgent. Fragile. I didn't want Ryan drowning while I still had air in my lungs. I stepped in not once, not twice, but every time something wobbled. At first, it felt like love. Later, it felt like obligation. And eventually, it felt like invisibility. My phone buzzed on the table, a message from Ryan. Morning, Mom. Hope you got home okay last night. I stared at it longer than necessary. The words were polite, appropriate, empty. I typed a reply, then erased it. Typed again, erased that too. I wasn't ready to speak, not yet. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about comprehension. Later that morning, I went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet, lawns damp with dew. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Life moving at its usual pace, indifferent to personal revelations. I thought of Evan again, the way he'd offered me his food without hesitation. No calculation, no discomfort, just instinct. Children recognize imbalance the way they recognize danger. By the time I returned home, the phone had buzzed twice more. Lauren this time. Did you leave early last night? Ryan said you seemed quiet. Quiet, that word again. Quiet has always been my default, but silence and submission are not the same thing. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled out another folder, older, thicker. Documents Paul had insisted we keep organized. Deeds, account summaries, notes in his handwriting. Paul had prepared more than I realized. As I turned the pages, something inside me steadied. This wasn't panic. This was inventory. An assessment of where I stood and how much of my footing I'd allowed others to stand on. One note in Paul's handwriting caught my eye, dated years ago. Keep access clean, help yes, control no. I exhaled slowly. He'd seen this coming, I hadn't wanted to. By late afternoon, the house felt different. Not colder, clearer. As if something heavy had been named and therefore no longer needed to sit on my chest. My phone buzzed again, this time it was Evan. Hi Grandma, Dad said you might be busy, just wanted to say I liked seeing you last night. I smiled despite myself. Thank you, sweetheart, I typed back. That means a lot. There was a pause, then another message. I noticed they didn't give you much food, that wasn't right. My fingers hovered over the screen. You're very observant, I replied finally, and very kind. I just thought you should know, he wrote. If it mattered. I set the phone down gently. It mattered. That evening, as the sun dipped lower, I made myself dinner, simple, warm, exactly what I wanted. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was mine. Afterward, I sat at the desk Paul used to occupy and pulled out a pen and paper. I didn't make a list of grievances, I made a list of connections, accounts tied to my name, cards shared, payments automated, no emotion. Just facts. By the time I finished, the list surprised even me. I hadn't just been helping, I had been underwriting their entire sense of stability, and yet at that table I had been treated as an afterthought. I folded the paper neatly and placed it back in the folder. Tomorrow I would make a call, not to Ryan, not to Lauren, to someone who understood boundaries better than apologies, someone who would help me correct, not punish. I turned off the lights and headed to bed. As I lay there, the quiet felt different from the night before, not heavy, not unresolved, intentional. By morning, things would begin to shift, not with noise, not with anger, but with action. And action I was finally ready for. Margaret Ellison woke before dawn the way she often did now, not because she had to, but because her mind no longer slept the way it used to. It wasn't racing. It was alert. Awake in a new way, she lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet house. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a delivery truck somewhere down the street, everything exactly where it had always been except her. She got up slowly, wrapped a cardigan around her shoulders, and made her way to the kitchen. As the kettle warmed, she looked out the window at the pale gray sky. Morning always felt honest. There was no performance yet. No one asking for anything. This was the hour Paul loved best. You can tell what matters before the noise starts, he used to say. Margaret poured her tea and sat at the table, the same one where she'd once helped Ryan with homework, where Evan had done science projects, where Paul had balanced checkbooks with quiet precision. Today, the table held only one thing, her notebook. Yesterday's list stared back at her. Accounts, cards, payments. She hadn't exaggerated. If anything, she'd understated how deeply her life was woven into theirs. She opened a fresh page and wrote one sentence at the top. What changes if I stop? The question felt dangerous and freeing. Her phone buzzed. Lauren, hi Margaret, just checking in. Ryan said you seemed a bit off lately. Margaret read it twice. The words were smooth, polished, exactly like Lauren herself. Concern without curiosity, inquiry without invitation. Margaret set the phone face down. She wasn't off. She was finally aligned. An hour later, she stood in front of her closet, choosing clothes carefully, not out of vanity, out of intention. She selected her navy coat, the one Paul always said made her look decisive. She smiled faintly at the memory. They worked methodically. Denise explained each step. Margaret listened, asked questions, signed where necessary. Her hand didn't shake. As each authorization was removed, something inside her loosened, not with relief, but with balance. These changes will take effect immediately, Denise said at last. Some linked accounts may experience interruptions. Margaret smiled faintly. Yes, she said, I expect they will. Denise hesitated, then spoke gently. This kind of adjustment can be disruptive. Are you prepared for reactions? Margaret thought of the cold plate, the empty wine glass, Evan's quiet kindness. I am, she said. When she left the office, the sun had fully risen. The world looked unchanged, but she felt taller moving through it. The first call came before she made it home. Ryan, she let it ring. The second came moments later. Lauren. Margaret placed the phone in her purse and kept driving. She wasn't avoiding them. She was choosing the order of things. At home, she set her bag down, made lunch, and ate without distraction. The quiet felt earned, then the messages began. Ryan, Mom, something's wrong with the card, call me. Ryan, the mortgage payment didn't go through. Lauren, Margaret, this is serious. My card was declined. Margaret read them calmly, one by one, like weather reports, predictable, loud, temporary. Her phone rang again, this time a different name. Evan, she answered. Hi, sweetheart. Hi, Grandma, Evan said. His voice was lower than usual, careful. I just wanted to check on you. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I'm okay, she said. Thank you for asking. There was a pause. Dad's really upset, Evan said. Mom too. They're talking to the bank. Margaret smiled gently. That's all right. Did you mean for this to happen? He asked. Margaret chose her words with care. I meant to take responsibility for my own life, she said. Sometimes that makes other people uncomfortable. Evan was quiet for a moment. Last night, he said slowly, when they gave you the leftovers, I didn't like that. Margaret felt something warm spread through her chest. I didn't either, she said, but thank you for noticing. I think, Evan said, uncertain but sincere, I think they forget sometimes. About you. Margaret swallowed. Yes, she said softly. They do. Well, Evan said, voice firmer now, I won't. When the call ended, Margaret sat still for a long time. She hadn't lost everything. She had simply stopped funding what diminished her. By mid-afternoon, the messages shifted in tone. Ryan, Mom, we need to talk. This affects the kids. Lauren, this is unfair. You can't just decide things like this. Margaret read them without flinching. She could decide, she always could have. She just hadn't. A car pulled into her driveway, too fast, too close. Margaret didn't move. A knock followed, sharp, insistent. Mom, Ryan's voice called through the door. Open up. Margaret took a breath and stood. When she opened the door, Ryan stood there flushed, phone still in his hand. Lauren sat in the car, arms crossed, staring straight ahead. What did you do? Ryan demanded. The bank says you removed access. The cards are frozen. The mortgage, I know, Margaret said calmly. You blindsided us, he said. You could have warned me. Margaret met his eyes. I could have, she said, but you didn't warn me when you stopped seeing me as more than a solution. Ryan opened his mouth. Closed it. Lauren leaned out of the car. Margaret, this is dramatic. We're family. Margaret turned toward her. Family doesn't feed someone leftovers and call it closeness, she said evenly. Lauren stiffened. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. So what, this is punishment? No, Margaret said, it's correction. For what? Ryan snapped. For years of assuming I would always absorb the cost of your comfort, Margaret replied, silence. The kind that arrives when truth has nowhere to hide. Ryan's voice dropped. I didn't know it felt like that. Margaret softened but did not retreat. You didn't ask, she said. Ryan looked away. We'll figure it out, he muttered. We always do, Margaret nodded. Yes, now you will. She closed the door gently. Inside, the house was quiet again, not lonely, clear. Margaret returned to the table and sat down. She didn't feel victorious. She felt honest. And honesty, she realized, was the beginning of everything that came next. The house felt different the morning after Ryan stood on her porch. Not heavier, not emptier, just awake. Margaret Ellison noticed it as she moved through the rooms, the way light settled on the furniture, the way the floorboards creaked without apology beneath her feet. For years, she had moved quietly in her own home, as if sound itself might inconvenience someone who wasn't even there. Today, she didn't. She brewed coffee instead of tea, strong, dark, the way Paul liked it. She poured it into her favorite mug, the one Lauren once called a little outdated and suggested replacing. Margaret had kept it anyway. Some things didn't need upgrading. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook again. This time, she didn't make a list. She wrote a memory. Paul standing at this counter, sleeves rolled up, saying, "Care that costs your dignity is too expensive." She traced the words with her finger. "I hear you now," she murmured. Her phone buzzed. She didn't rush to it. When she finally looked, there were no missed calls, just a single message. Ryan. "Can we talk later? Not to argue, just talk." Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment, then she typed back, "Yes, this evening." She set the phone down and finished her coffee slowly, deliberately. The difference between urgency and intention was something she was only just beginning to relearn. By afternoon, the ripple effects of her decision had spread further than she expected. Denise Carter called. "I wanted to let you know," Denise said calmly, "that there have been multiple inquiries from your son's accounts. They were persistent." Margaret smiled faintly. "I imagine they were. I assured them everything was done legally and correctly," Denise continued. "But I also want to say this, what you did was appropriate, long overdue from what I can see." Margaret felt a surprising tightness behind her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. After the call ended, she sat in the living room, hands folded in her lap. Praise wasn't something she sought, but being seen, truly seen, felt unfamiliar in the best way. She thought of Lauren now, pacing perhaps, rehearsing explanations, reframing the situation to protect appearances. Lauren was skilled at that. Everything in her life was strategic, words, gestures, smiles calibrated for maximum advantage. Margaret had mistaken polish for care. She wouldn't again. Evan arrived just before dinner as the sky softened into evening. He didn't knock loudly, just a gentle tap. When Margaret opened the door, he stood there with his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes searching her face. "Hi, Grandma," she smiled. "Come in." He stepped inside and glanced around as if checking whether the house itself had changed. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, then hesitated. "I mean, kind of." They sat at the table together. Margaret placed a bowl of soup in front of him, the kind he liked, nothing fancy, just warm and steady. He ate quietly for a few minutes before speaking. "Mom's mad," he said finally. "Dad's confused." Margaret nodded. "And you?" Evan looked down at his spoon. "I think," he said carefully, "that you did something scary but necessary." Margaret reached across the table and rested her hand over his. "That's very perceptive." He shrugged. "I've been watching for a while." That didn't surprise her. "I don't think they meant to hurt you," he added. "They just forgot you were a person." The words landed softly but solidly. "Yes," Margaret said. "That's exactly it." Evan looked up. "Are you okay with them being upset?" Margaret considered the question. "I'm okay with discomfort," she said. "I'm not okay with disappearing." Evan nodded, absorbing that. Before he left, he hugged her longer than usual. "Don't undo it," he whispered. Margaret closed her eyes. "I won't." Ryan arrived just after sunset. This time he knocked normally. When Margaret opened the door, he stood there alone. No Lauren, no phone in his hand, that mattered. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. They sat across from each other in the living room. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was unfamiliar. It had been years since they'd spoken without distraction. "I didn't sleep last night," Ryan said finally. Margaret didn't respond. She waited. "I kept thinking about that dinner," he continued. "And other things? Like what?" she asked gently. He rubbed his hands together, "Like how often we come to you only when something breaks." Margaret's chest tightened, but she stayed still. "I told myself it was normal," he said. "Family helping family? And now," she asked. "And now I see," he admitted, "that I stopped asking whether you were okay with it." She nodded once. "That's the part that hurt." Ryan swallowed. "Lauren doesn't see it that way." Margaret smiled sadly. "I know. She thinks this is about control," Ryan said. "About money." "And you?" Margaret asked. He hesitated. "I think it's about respect." Something loosened inside her. "I don't know how to fix it," Ryan said. "I don't even know where to start." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You don't start by asking me to carry you again," she said. "You start by carrying yourself." He nodded slowly. "I can try. I don't need perfection," Margaret said. "I need honesty." Ryan stood to leave a few minutes later. At the door, he paused. "I forgot how strong you are," he said quietly. Margaret met his eyes. "No," she corrected gently. "You forgot to look." After he left, Margaret stood alone in the doorway for a long moment. She felt tired, but it was the good kind. The kind that comes from truth spoken aloud. That night she slept deeply. No lists, no rehearsed conversations, no shrinking, just rest. In the quiet hours before dawn, something shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. Margaret Ellison was no longer the safety net beneath everyone else's life. She was standing in her own, and the ground, she realized, was solid enough to hold her. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, quiet, but not lonely. Margaret Ellison woke early each morning as she always had, but now there was no knot in her chest urging her to brace for someone else's need. The phone stayed mostly still on the counter. When it did buzz, she no longer jumped. She moved through her routines with intention, watering the plants, sorting mail, taking slow walks around the neighborhood, her posture straighter than it had been in years. People nodded at her, neighbors who had lived beside her for decades but had rarely seen her outside of errands or obligations. It occurred to her that she had been present all along, just invisible. That realization no longer hurt. It clarified. Midweek, Denise Carter stopped by the house. I was in the area, Denise said, setting her briefcase down neatly, and I thought it might be easier to go over a few things in person. Margaret poured tea and listened as Denise reviewed account changes, future safeguards, and quiet protections put in place to ensure nothing could be altered without Margaret's consent. You've been generous, Denise said plainly, but generosity without boundaries turns into entitlement faster than people realize. Margaret nodded. I learned that late. Late, Denise corrected, is still better than never. Before leaving, Denise paused at the door. For what it's worth, she added, you handled this with more grace than most people half your age. Margaret smiled, not out of pride but recognition. Grace didn't mean silence anymore. Lauren was the last to reach out. The message arrived late one afternoon, carefully worded, perfectly polished. Lauren, Margaret, I think we should clear the air. This situation has been very stressful for the family. I'd hate for misunderstandings to damage relationships. Margaret read it twice. Then she set the phone down. She didn't respond immediately. That evening, Evan came over again, unannounced this time, which made her smile. Dad says Mom's trying to smooth things over, he said, rolling his eyes slightly as he accepted a cookie from the plate on the counter. Margaret raised an eyebrow. And what does that mean to you? It means, Evan said carefully, she wants things to look normal again. Even if they're not. Margaret studied him for a moment. You're very perceptive, she said. He shrugged. I've had practice. They sat together in the living room, the lamp casting a warm circle of light around them. Are you going to talk to her? Evan asked. Yes, Margaret said, but not the way she expects. Lauren arrived 2 days later. She dressed as she always did, tailored, neutral tones, jewelry subtle but expensive. Her smile was polite, practiced. Margaret invited her in and gestured toward the armchair across from her own. Lauren sat, crossing her legs neatly. I'll be honest, Lauren began. This situation caught us off guard. I imagine it did, Margaret replied calmly. Lauren smiled thinly. We've always considered ourselves close. Margaret didn't interrupt. I think what happened at dinner was unfortunate, Lauren continued. But reacting so drastically, well, it created unnecessary chaos. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. What felt unnecessary to you, she said evenly, felt overdue to me. Lauren blinked, recalibrating. No one intended to disrespect you, she said. We've just been under pressure. So was I, Margaret replied. For years, Lauren shifted in her seat. Families make sacrifices, she said. Yes, Margaret agreed. But sacrifice without acknowledgement becomes expectation. The room grew quiet. Lauren tried again, softer this time. Ryan is struggling, the kids are affected. Surely we can find a compromise. Margaret met her gaze steadily. A compromise implies both sides were equal, she said. They weren't. Lauren inhaled slowly. So this is about money, Margaret shook her head. This is about visibility, she said. About being treated as a person instead of a solution. Lauren's expression tightened, not with anger but discomfort. I'm not asking for apologies, Margaret continued. I'm asking for change. And if we can't, Lauren asked. Margaret didn't hesitate. Then this distance remains. Lauren stood shortly after. At the door she paused. I hope you know, she said coolly, that families don't always survive boundaries like this. Margaret smiled gently. Some families don't survive without them. After Lauren left, Margaret felt no rush of guilt, only relief. That night Ryan called. I heard you talk to Lauren, he said. Yes, Margaret replied. There was a long pause. She's not happy, he admitted. I didn't do this to make her happy, Margaret said. I did it to stop erasing myself. Another pause. I'm trying, Ryan said finally. I really am. I see that, Margaret replied, and I appreciate it. But things won't go back to how they were, he said, almost pleading. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. No, she said, they won't, and that's not a loss. The following weekend, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She hosted. Not a family obligation, not a holiday, just a quiet gathering. She invited 2 neighbors, an old friend she'd lost touch with, and Evan. No pressure, no performance. The house filled with easy conversation, shared laughter, and the kind of warmth that didn't require effort. Evan watched it all quietly, then leaned toward her. This feels different, he said. It is, Margaret replied. It's mutual. Later, after everyone left, Margaret stood alone in the living room, surveying the empty cups, the lingering scent of coffee. She wasn't tired. She felt expanded. She thought of Paul again, of his quiet warnings, his steady presence. I finally listened, she whispered. That night, she wrote one sentence in her notebook: love should never require disappearance. She underlined it once, not for emphasis. For commitment. Margaret Ellison went to bed knowing that whatever came next, anger, adjustment, distance, or healing, she would meet it standing upright. No longer shrinking, no longer leftover, just whole. Margaret Ellison woke before dawn the way she always had, but this morning the quiet felt different. Not heavy, not hollow, intentional. The house breathed around her, floorboards settling, the refrigerator humming softly, the faint sound of a delivery truck somewhere down the street. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, hands resting on her knees, and realized something simple and profound. She was no longer waiting for the day to demand something from her. She was choosing how it would begin. She dressed slowly, selecting a soft gray sweater Paul had once liked because it made her look steady. In the kitchen, she brewed tea and stood by the window as the sky lightened. For decades, mornings had been a mental inventory of what others might need. Who might call, what bill might bounce, which quiet problem would land on her shoulders before noon. Today, there was none of that. The stillness didn't scare her anymore. By mid-morning, the first ripple came. Her phone buzzed once, then again. Ryan. She didn't answer immediately. She finished rinsing her cup, dried it, and set it carefully in the cabinet. Only then did she pick up the phone. Mom, Ryan said quickly, his voice tight. I just got off the phone with the bank. They confirmed everything's permanent. Yes, Margaret said calmly. It is. This isn't sustainable, he said. We're scrambling. I had to move money around just to cover the car payment. Margaret leaned against the counter. I believe that's what adults do when finances are their responsibility. Silence followed. Not angry silence, uncertain silence. I'm not blaming you, Ryan said after a moment, though the words didn't quite align with his tone. I just don't understand how we got here. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. We got here one small assumption at a time, she said. Each time you assumed I would cover it, each time I didn't correct you. That's not fair, he said. You never said no. And you never asked if you should stop, Margaret replied gently. He exhaled sharply. Lauren says you're trying to teach us a lesson. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm not teaching, I'm choosing. Another pause. What does that mean for us? Ryan asked. It means, Margaret said, that our relationship can finally be about care instead of transactions. Ryan didn't respond right away. I don't know how to do that, he admitted quietly. Margaret softened. Neither did I at first. They ended the call without resolution but without sharpness. That felt like progress. Later that afternoon, Denise Carter called to check in. I wanted to let you know, Denise said, there were 2 attempted authorization requests today, both denied. Margaret's grip tightened slightly around the phone. From Ryan, yes, Denise confirmed. And one from a shared credit account Lauren used to manage. Margaret exhaled. Thank you for the update. You did the right thing, Denise said. Boundaries often provoke one last grab for control. Margaret hung up and sat down at the table. For a brief moment, doubt flickered. Not regret, just the old instinct to smooth things over, to make it easier for everyone else. But then she thought of the cold plate at dinner, the way her presence had been minimized without a second thought, and the doubt passed. That evening, Evan stopped by again. I heard Dad on the phone, he said as he kicked off his shoes. He's stressed. I know, Margaret replied. He's not sleeping much. Margaret studied her grandson's face. 16, but already reading the world more clearly than most adults. Stress can be instructive, she said, if it doesn't turn into blame. Evan nodded. Mom's angry, not yelling angry, quiet angry. Margaret sighed softly. Lauren prefers control to confrontation. Evan hesitated, then said, "She thinks you're being dramatic." Margaret smiled, not unkindly. Women are often called dramatic when they stop tolerating discomfort. Evan smiled back, relieved. "I'm glad you're not backing down." "I'm glad you notice," Margaret replied. They sat together at the table working through Evan's homework. Algebra problems, simple and direct. Margaret found comfort in the clarity of numbers. There was always an answer, no manipulation, no hidden cost. As Evan packed up to leave, he paused. "Grandma," he said, "if Dad and Mom mess this up, I still want to come here." Margaret reached for his hand. "This will always be a place you're welcome." After he left, Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the porch light glow against the dark. She felt sadness not for what she'd lost, but for how long it had taken to arrive here. The next morning brought another call, this time from Lauren. "Margaret," Lauren said, her voice measured. "We need to talk in person." Margaret considered. "About what?" "About moving forward," Lauren replied. "This tension isn't healthy." Margaret's tone remained calm. Neither was the imbalance. A pause. "Ryan is spiraling," Lauren said, "and frankly, this is affecting our family's stability." Margaret nodded to herself. "Then it's time your family builds its own." "That's easy for you to say," Lauren snapped before catching herself. "You're secure." Margaret's voice cooled. "I'm secure because I stopped subsidizing instability." Lauren inhaled sharply. "You're punishing us?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'm opting out of being used." Silence stretched. Finally, Lauren said, "I didn't realize you felt this way." Margaret replied evenly, "That's because no one ever asked." They agreed to meet later that week, neutral ground, no raised voices. Margaret ended the call feeling steady, though tired. That afternoon, she opened the small wooden box Paul had kept in his dresser. Inside were old receipts, a faded photo of the two of them on a windy beach, and a note in his handwriting. She had read it before, but now the words landed differently. "Dignity costs less than resentment," Paul had written, "but it must be defended early." Margaret traced the ink with her finger. "I'm defending it now," she murmured. The meeting with Lauren happened 2 days later at a quiet cafe. Lauren arrived composed, her expression carefully neutral. Margaret ordered tea. Lauren spoke first. "I won't pretend this hasn't been disruptive." Margaret nodded. "Disruption is often the sound of correction." Lauren tightened her jaw. "Ryan feels abandoned." Margaret met her gaze. "I feel seen for the first time in years." Lauren leaned back. "Do you understand what people will say?" Margaret smiled faintly. "People always talk when a woman stops being convenient." Lauren studied her for a long moment. "You've changed." "No," Margaret replied. "I've stopped hiding." They left without agreement, but with clarity. That mattered more. That night, Margaret returned home and turned on every lamp in the living room. Light filled the space. She sat in her chair, wrapped in a blanket, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the transition. Not grief, not triumph, adjustment. Her phone buzzed once more, a text from Ryan. "I'm scared I messed this up beyond repair," Margaret typed back slowly. "This isn't the end of our relationship, it's the end of one version of it." She set the phone down and rested her hands in her lap. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Balance. For the first time, Margaret Ellison wasn't holding the family together by disappearing inside it. She was standing in her own life, visible, grounded, and unafraid of what came next. The meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon, chosen carefully by Lauren because Sundays felt symbolic to her, family days, reset days, days when difficult conversations were supposed to soften under the weight of tradition. Margaret recognized the tactic immediately. She agreed anyway. They met at Ryan and Lauren's house, the one Margaret had helped them secure years ago with a temporary contribution that never returned. As Margaret stepped inside, she noticed how immaculate everything looked. The house always did. Lauren kept it that way, as if order itself could prevent discomfort. Ryan stood when Margaret entered, uncertainty written across his face. He looked older than he had a month ago. Stress had a way of stripping polish quickly. "Mom," he said. "Thanks for coming." Margaret nodded. "Thank you for asking." Lauren gestured toward the living room. "Let's sit." Evan hovered near the hallway, backpack slung over one shoulder. He offered Margaret a small smile before retreating upstairs without being told. Margaret felt a quiet surge of gratitude for his instinct. They sat. The space between them felt measured, deliberate. Ryan spoke first. "We've been doing a lot of talking." Margaret waited. Lauren folded her hands. "We underestimated how much we depended on you." Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's one way to phrase it." Lauren inhaled, then continued. "I won't pretend this hasn't been hard, but we're adjusting." Ryan nodded. "We've had to restructure things, sell the second car. Cancel some extras." Margaret's expression didn't change. "That sounds responsible." Ryan swallowed. "It doesn't feel that way yet." Lauren leaned forward. "We want to understand what you need from us now." Margaret took a moment before answering. Not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to be precise. "I need acknowledgement," she said. "Not gratitude, awareness. I need to know that my presence in this family isn't conditional on what I provide." Ryan nodded quickly. "I see that now." Lauren hesitated. "I didn't grow up the way Ryan did," she said carefully. "Support meant achievement, independence. If someone helped you financially, it meant you had failed somewhere." Margaret met her gaze. "Then perhaps that's why you were so comfortable letting me carry what you considered failure." Lauren stiffened but didn't deny it. Ryan leaned forward. "Mom, I don't want things to stay strained. I don't want Evan growing up thinking family only works when money's involved." Margaret softened. "Neither do I." There was a knock on the ceiling, Evan's signal from upstairs. Ryan called out, "We're okay." Margaret smiled faintly. Lauren shifted in her seat. "There's something else," she said. "We assumed wrongly that you'd always step in, and when you didn't, it felt like rejection." Margaret nodded slowly. "Boundaries often feel like rejection to people who benefit from having none." Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't sharp. It felt workable. Ryan cleared his throat. "I want to start over, not with money. With effort." Margaret looked at him, really looked. For the first time in years, she saw him not as her responsibility, but as a man trying awkwardly to grow. "I'm open to that," she said, "but slowly." Lauren exhaled. "That's fair." The conversation shifted then away from finances and into safer territory. Evan's school, Ryan's work, Margaret's garden, ordinary things. It felt strange, but also grounding. When Margaret stood to leave, Ryan walked her to the door. "I didn't realize how much pressure I put on you," he said quietly. "I thought because you never complained you were okay." Margaret smiled sadly. "Silence is often mistaken for strength." He nodded. "I don't want to repeat that with Evan." Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Then don't." As she stepped outside, the late afternoon sun warmed her face. She breathed deeply, feeling neither victorious nor defeated, just present. That evening, Denise Carter called again. "They tried one more access request this afternoon," Denise said. "It was blocked." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you for staying vigilant." "That's my job," Denise replied. "But I'll say this, most people struggle with this part. You're handling it with remarkable clarity." Margaret smiled. "Clarity came after exhaustion?" After the call, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and pulled out a notebook. She began writing not plans, not lists, but reflections. What she would tolerate, what she wouldn't. What she wanted the rest of her life to look like without apology. Paul's voice echoed in her memory, dignity over sacrifice. She slept deeply that night. The next morning, she woke to a message from Evan. "Grandma, Dad asked me to help with groceries today. He says we're doing a reset. Just wanted you to know." Margaret chuckled softly. "Reset." The word felt tentative, hopeful. She replied, "I'm proud of you." And of him. As the day unfolded, Margaret felt a subtle shift inside her. Not relief exactly, but trust. Not in others, but in herself. Trust that she would notice the moment things began to slide again. Trust that she wouldn't shrink to prevent discomfort. In the afternoon, she took a walk through the neighborhood. Neighbors waved. A woman she barely knew complimented her scarf. Margaret thanked her without deflecting. When she returned home, she found a handwritten note slipped through her mail slot. It was from Lauren. "I don't know how to undo what's been normalized for years, but I see it now, and I'm trying." Lauren. Margaret read it twice. Then she placed it carefully in the drawer, not as evidence, not as leverage, but as a marker of movement. That night, Margaret cooked a small dinner for herself. She set the table properly, used the good plate, poured a modest glass of wine. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. No leftovers. For the first time, she understood something clearly. Change didn't arrive with apologies or grand gestures. It arrived in recalibration, in what people did when the old system stopped working. And Margaret Ellison was no longer the system everyone leaned on without question. She was a woman who had stepped into visibility. And the family, whether they liked it or not, was learning how to meet her there. The change didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, like most things that last. Margaret Ellison noticed it first in the smallest details. The phone stopped ringing with urgency. Messages no longer opened with panic or expectation. When Ryan called now, it was to ask how she was, not to ask what she could fix. That difference mattered more than any apology. On a cool Tuesday morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a folded letter in her hands. It was from Denise Carter, neatly typed, precise as always. Final confirmation, Denise had written. All accounts are secure, no shared access. Everything is now structured exactly as you requested. You are fully protected. Margaret read the sentence twice. Fully protected. She hadn't realized how long she'd lived without that feeling. She placed the letter into a slim folder labeled simply, "My affairs, not family, not emergency. Hers." Later that day, Evan came by on his bike, backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. He didn't knock, just rang the bell once, polite but comfortable. "Hey, Grandma," he said when she opened the door. "Mom said I could bring you the bread I baked. It's not perfect." Margaret smiled warmly. "Neither am I. Come in." They sat at the table together, tearing the bread apart with their hands. Evan talked about school, about a teacher who challenged him, about a friend who was struggling at home. "You know," he said suddenly, "things feel different lately." Margaret tilted her head. "Different how?" He shrugged. "Quieter, but not in a bad way. Dad listens more. Mom doesn't rush through conversations anymore. It's like they're aware of space now." Margaret nodded. "Awareness changes how people move." Evan looked at her thoughtfully. "Did you know this would happen?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I hoped, but I didn't act for an outcome. I acted for myself." Evan smiled. "That's kind of brave." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "It's necessary." That evening Ryan called, not urgent, not strained. "Mom," he said, "Lauren and I talked again. We're setting a new budget, a real one." "That's good," Margaret replied. "There's something else," he added. "We'd like to invite you for dinner this weekend. No expectations, no agendas, just dinner. And if you don't feel like it, that's okay." Margaret felt something soften in her chest, not obligation, choice. "I'll think about it," she said, "and I appreciate how you asked." After the call, she stood by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade. She didn't feel the need to decide right away. That, too, was new. The weekend came gently. Margaret did go to dinner. She brought a small dessert, not because she felt she should, but because she wanted to. The table was set evenly this time. No one rushed. No one dismissed. Lauren caught Margaret's eye more than once, not with strategy, but with something closer to respect. When dinner ended, Ryan cleared the plates without being asked. Evan helped. Lauren poured tea. Margaret watched them quietly, not with suspicion, but with discernment. She knew now the difference. As she prepared to leave, Lauren walked her to the door. "I won't pretend I understand everything yet," Lauren said carefully. "But I do understand this. You were giving from a place we never questioned. And that wasn't fair." Margaret nodded. "Fairness often arrives late." Lauren hesitated, then added, "Thank you for not disappearing." Margaret met her gaze. "Thank you for noticing before it was too late." At home, Margaret changed into her comfortable clothes and sat in her favorite chair. The house felt full, not of noise, but of presence. She thought of Paul then, of his quiet warnings, of his belief that dignity should never require erasure. She smiled softly, imagining what he might say now. "You finally listened." "Yes," she whispered into the stillness. "I did." In the weeks that followed, Margaret filled her days with things she'd postponed for years. A writing group at the library, morning walks with neighbors. Lunch dates she didn't cancel for anyone else's convenience. She stopped explaining herself. When Denise called one last time to check in, she said, "Most people your age are afraid to change the balance." Margaret replied calmly, "Most people my age are tired of pretending imbalance is love." One afternoon, Margaret received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note from Evan. "Grandma, thank you for teaching me that being kind doesn't mean being invisible." She held the note to her chest for a long moment. That night, Margaret prepared dinner again for herself. She lit a candle, played soft music, ate slowly, no leftovers, no shrinking, just a woman who finally understood that love, real love, makes room instead of taking it. As she washed her plate and turned off the light, Margaret Ellison felt something settle inside her, not triumph, not bitterness, but peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had reclaimed her place. And this time she intended to keep it.